Welcome to your first Iraq briefing of the new year. I'm Eric Gustafson.
And I'm Omar Nadawi.
We are with Enabling Peace in Iraq Center, and as you know, every week we come to you with your latest briefing on Iraq. Today, we are looking, of course, at some major changes, a change of management here in Washington, D.C. A new president will soon be seated, President Trump. This will be his second term. What does that mean for Iraq? So we're going to take a deep dive into that, looking at what the first Trump administration looked like in terms of U.S. Iraq policy and what we can expect going forward with him returning to office. So what were the main features of U.S.-Iraq relations during the first Trump administration?
I think there was a fundamental difference between how the Trump administration looked at Iraq and how previous administrations did. So I think prior to that point, Iraq was seen as a project to invest in, and to a lesser extent during the Obama administration as a project to be distanced from. But for Trump, everything in Iraq was seen from the prism of policy towards Iran and hostility with Iran, and Iraq was seen as a project that was lost to Iran. And that led to a very different attitude in dealing with the country that translated into a significant reduction in diplomatic engagement. And this was complicated and fed by the growing hostility between Iran and the United States, and between Iraqi, Iran-backed militias and the United States forces. So we saw the administration shut down the consulate in Basra, and we saw the administration also threaten to shut down the Baghdad embassy, which is an unprecedented move. And we also saw the Trump administration threatening to put all of Iraq under sanctions, under economic sanctions, over as punishment for the growing influence of Iran inside Iraq and Iran's ability to use Iraq's economy to bypass sanctions. So
it seemed to become like a vicious cycle, because I remember the protests that were being staged outside the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, right, by the militias. We saw an escalation of attacks on U.S. forces by the militias, just firing rockets at the bases there. So it seemed like it was like the hardliners in Washington and in Tehran were like kind of feeding off each other at the expense of Iraq.
Right. Yeah. And as you know, that culminated in January of 2020 with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Mohandes in Baghdad, which had a lot of unintended consequences for both the U.S. and for Iran. At the time, the Shireen protests were in full swing in Baghdad. And I think you documented and you looked carefully at what the impact was of the assassination on the Tishrin. You want to?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we'll include a link to our Tishrin report, but this was a really important social movement happening within Iraq, especially led by young people, really pushing for greater transparency, accountability, improvements in governance. Human rights was very much at the top of the agenda. And this was, it was a very popular movement that began in really early, like September 2019. It began to gain force. The reason it's called Tishrin is after, of course, October.
Yeah.
So in October of 2019, it really took off. Mass protests, and there started to be real violence in pushing back. And when the assassination took place on January 3rd, 2020, there was still a Tishrin movement, but now it became a real issue because it made it easier for militias to accuse the Tishrin protesters of being foreign agents. And you can speak a little bit more about that, about like how, the role that not only the militias fighting back, but it also losing support of Muqtada.
Yes, the assassination polarized the political situation, and Muqtada Sadr and his followers, there are a lot of questions about them. They had decided initially to side with the protesters and provide protection for the protesters from the attacks by the Iran-backed militias. But the polarization that was created by the assassination really prompted the Saudis to shift sides, to switch, and join the chorus talking about having to respond to American violations of Iraqi sovereignty, and they started cracking down on the protesters. They turned from protectors into oppressors, and also that gave the Iran-backed militias a free hand to viciously attack protesters. And within weeks, we saw a number of bloody attacks and severe human rights violations that targeted the protesters in Baghdad and Nasiriyah and elsewhere. And dozens of innocent protesters were actually killed or disappeared during that phase, and severely sapped the momentum of the protest and weakened them.
Wow. Yeah. And can you speak also about what some of the unintended consequences of the assassination of Soleimani had for security?
Of course. I mean, there were, I think, on the tactical level, not sort of technical, on the operational level, it led to a disruption in cooperation between Iraqi forces and the global coalition, which is led by the U.S. in fighting ISIS. But on the geostrategic level, it also actually delivered Iran a victory, something that Iran and the militias have been dreaming of for years, which is that it precipitated a vote and a movement within Iraq's parliament to call for the expulsion of U.S. forces from Iraq. And in the past, Iraqi governments, prime ministers, regardless of their orientations, they typically did not support calls for the expulsion of U.S. forces, even if they wanted that in their heart. But they understood the importance of cooperation, of continued security cooperation in the United States. Prime Minister al-Ahmadi at the time had rejected calls to expel U.S. forces, but after the assassination, he actually lent his support for that motion, and which Parliament took within days after the assassination. So that really was the most significant unintended consequence, I think, on U.S.-Iraq relations and on Iran's ambitions in Iraq.
And that, of course, the swing of that pendulum in that way, enter the Biden administration, you couldn't stop that. And so now there is an agreement for the U.S. to act in Iraq.
Yeah.
So what can we expect in terms of U.S.-Iraq policy as Trump returns to office?
Well, I think there is focus now on what happens next with regard to Iran. And that's especially the case because Iran now is in a weakened state after the defeats faced by its allies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and lastly, more importantly, the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. So there are a lot of discussions about what to do next, how to reshape Iran's role in the region in a way that is favorable to regional security and to international security in terms of nuclear program, in terms of support for proxies, in terms to its destabilizing role in the region. And while there are a lot of arguments in support of diplomatic efforts to reopen negotiations, trade, potentially cooperation on the nuclear program, on nuclear transparency, for sanctions relief, there are also hawkish voices that are calling for using this Iranian moment of weakness to undertake military action. And the findings that whatever happens between the U.S. and Iran is likely to have fallout in Iraq. The Iran-backed Iraqi militias are basically right now Iran's, the only remaining elements of Iran's power projection tools outside of its borders, in addition to the Houthis in Yemen, but after the loss of Hamas, again, Hezbollah and Assad. So if we see pressure by Washington on Baghdad or direct action by Washington against the Iraqi militias in conjunction with a campaign against Iran, that can have very destabilizing, I think, results for Iraq. And I think that could be avoided because I think there is a lot of room right now to pursue diplomatic, political, and economic incentives and solutions to the militia problem in Iraq. And I don't think there is necessarily, I don't think that a military action or a military option is inevitable, whether it's for the militias or for Iran. So I think rushing to a military solution would be ill-advised. We can also see some perhaps impact on the economic conditions. Again, going back to the question of sanctions, you and I talked a few weeks ago about how Iran is using the Iraqi fuel oil trade to potentially bypass sanctions, and not potential, to actively bypass sanctions to the tune of billions of dollars a year. And we could see a new push by Washington to punish all that for that, and that could take the form of economic sanctions. We could also see, I think, a new push to potentially force a cessation of energy imports from Iran to Iraq, and that can have disruptive effects. But could also have, I think, an impact on humanitarian and development cooperation and aid.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing, just to touch back on the energy sector, if you cut off, for example, the natural gas
Yeah.
coming from Iran to Iraq in the midst of another hot summer,
Well,
that's going to be hugely destabilizing. In fact, there is a connection between some of the protests that happen in terms of the season because of the cuts, the outages of electricity. So yeah, that would be
absolutely right.
disruptive.
The lack of basic services is a major, I think, source of discontent in Iraq. And that's why you often see a correlation between hot summer months and protest.
Yeah. But yeah, what you were saying earlier, like in terms of civil society, yes, I mean, we can expect budget cuts, especially in terms of international development, humanitarian assistance. Iraq is handling still a lot of displaced Iraqis because of the conflicts. The Yazidis are still not fully resettled back in Sinjar, so you still have a significant Yazidi population that's displaced. You have Lebanese refugees, you have other refugee movements. That's of course in play. We don't know how that's going to shape out. But what we do know is that the UN is leaving Iraq at the end of this year. So there is a need for this transition period of providing some of the assistance to strengthen governance, to improve the performance of ministries, to meet the needs of Iraqis. And we might see a decrease in that kind of assistance, and also a decrease in support for Iraqi civil society. And Iraqi civil society, I think, continues to play a very important role in terms of pushing for greater accountability, more transparency, addressing issues like getting the Iraqi government to be more responsive to some of the issues that are happening in local communities. And we may see a loss in that.
Yeah. But you know what? I'm curious. What happens next time Trump wants to go to Iraq?
Yes, that's a really good question. Given because of the assassination, I think the Iraqi courts had something to say about that.
Yeah, they in 2021, an Iraqi court issued an arrest warrant for Donald Trump over the assassination of Soleimani and Abu Mahdi in Baghdad. So it's going to get awkward.
Yeah, it'll be real awkward real fast. So we'll have to see what happens there. Well, thanks so much for joining us for your first Iraq briefing of the new year. You can count on us coming to you almost weekly throughout the year with more briefings. And I also encourage you to check out our latest Iraq Security and Humanitarian Monitor, ISHM, the weekly Iraq report that you write and edit. Take a look at it because there's some really interesting talk within Iraq about the militias and about formalizing their role. So I think there's some interesting opportunities there. So, we'll be following that weekly.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, share us with others, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks so much.
Ma salam.